O ye who believe, the law of equality is prescribed to you in cases of murder.
No, I didn't kill Yvonne Gilford. I want to prove to the rest of the world that I'm innocent, and I won't be happy until I actually do that.
The free for the free, the slave for the slave, the woman for the woman.
I said, "What strange scratches?" And she said, yes, that's Purdy, you know. She said, I play with her on the sofa and she wraps her feet around me and she makes these little scratches. So I accepted that in one part of my mind, but I think in another part of my mind, I thought those looked like fingernail marks.
But if any remission is made by the brother of the slain, then grant any reasonable demand and compensate him with handsome gratitude. On December the 12th, 1996, Australian nurse Yvonne Gilford was found brutally murdered in her room at the Dhahran Hospital, Saudi Arabia. The punishment for this crime is beheading. British nurse Deborah Parry was convicted of the murder and sentenced to death. Released by the King of Saudi Arabia in May 1998 and back in England, she says she is innocent. This film tells why, 12,000 miles away in Jamestown, South Australia, Frank Gilford, the brother of the victim, has never believed Deborah Parry's story, and how, nevertheless, he saved her life.
A tiny amount will kickstart dozens of different tank mixes.
Frank Gilford and his wife Laurel run a courier business from their house, making parcel deliveries over a large area of South Australia. On December the 13th, they were out delivering as usual.
It was a Friday, and Frank had just got back from Orroroo and I was late getting in, and he came up to me and he said, your mate wants you on the phone. And he said, Laurel, has Frank got a sister called Yvonne? And I said, yes. And he said, well, she's been killed. And I was just devastated, and I didn't know how to go out and tell Frank, so I just stumbled out to the door and I said, Frank, Yvonne's dead. And he just threw his arms up in the air and he said, what the bloody hell happened here? And that was it.
This is National 9 News.
Yvonne Gilford would have turned 56 today. Instead of making a surprise birthday call to his sister, Frank Gilford is today trying to come to terms with her sudden and tragic murder.
Well, you've got no time to think or feel anything, you know. You got suddenly a great mass of people on your doorstep demanding and telling you things that you know nothing about, that you haven't had a chance to find out, and they all maintain that what they're telling you is true fact. And most of the stuff we found out afterwards wasn't true. It was just supposition on their sides of what they thought the truth was. And was very traumatic for us to be suddenly landed in something that basically we knew nothing about. And we didn't have the full details of what actually happened to Yvonne.
The breakthrough comes 8 days after Yvonne Gilford's family was told of her murder. The Adelaide woman was found bashed and suffocated in her room at the King Fahd Military Hospital in Dhahran, where she'd been working. Today, authorities confirmed they'd arrested 2 of her colleagues and charged them with murder.
Robbery has now emerged as the most likely motive for the murder of 55-year-old Yvonne Gilford. It's taken 2 weeks for the details to filter through from the Middle East. Today, a diplomat was quoted as saying the 2 nurses who'd been detained over the killing have confessed.
Arrested in a Saudi bank 1 week after the murder, British nurse Lucille McClauchlan confessed to the police first. She said that her colleague, nurse Deborah Parry, had stabbed Yvonne Gilford during a ferocious fight caused by the breakup of their relationship. Deborah Parry, too, was said to have confessed hours later. The nurses later withdrew their confessions and have since maintained their innocence. From the beginning in Jamestown, Frank and Laurel Gilford were receiving information from friends of Yvonne in the Saudi hospital. These letters and phone calls reinforced their feeling that the nurses were responsible for the brutal murder of Yvonne.
Many a time I would have had about 1 hour's sleep, and I'd toss and turn, and Frank would say to me, "For God's sake, woman, go to sleep." And I just couldn't close off. I'd see Yvonne laying there in a pool of blood, and I'd see these girls there stabbing her and all that, and she's fighting, you know, and it's just horrible.
Yvonne was Frank's kid sister. They had a close childhood together on the family farm in the outback.
Oh, the usual things. Annoy hell out of Dad, go around the sheep with him, help in the sheep yards. All things kids do, you know.
So it's like living on in a big farm with a lot of space, animals.
Well, if you reckon 384,000 acres is a big farm, which is, I suppose, is a big farm. A very, very, very big farm. But that's going back a long, long time ago. Well, there's only basically me and the sister and any of the married couples on the station that had children. We just sort of all congregated together and did our own things. Just the two of us. Well, last time we saw her was about a month before, or no, just before she left to catch the plane to go to Saudi. We saw her on the weekend and she flew out on the Monday. And we did the usual things, said our goodbyes and had meals together and made sure everything was organised before she flew out.
In Saudi Arabia, the Islamic law is based on the teachings of the Holy Quran. The Quran says that the family of the victim plays a crucial role in the sentence prescribed for murder. If the state decrees capital punishment, the closest relatives of the victim can exercise mercy, waiving the sentence in exchange for blood money or reasonable compensation. This appeared to give Frank Gilford the choice of life over death. It was a dilemma the Western media seized on. Frank Gilford's initial reaction to his sister's death was to refuse to waive the maximum penalty in the Saudi justice system, execution. And you believe in the death penalty for some crimes?
Yeah, in certain crimes, yeah. There's certain horrific crimes that definitely need the death penalty or some version of it. Until a few years ago, you used to have hangings in Australia. I believe England was the same. In France, they had the guillotine. So what's the difference between hacking the head off with a sword versus hacking their head off with the guillotine? Or hanging by your neck from a rope? Or sitting in a chair with electric current going through you, your eyeballs popping out and your smoke coming out your ear holes, and you know, what's the difference? You're still just as dead.
If I was that angry initially, which I think you must feel anger that somebody's murdered your sister, it takes a long, long time to work through all of those emotions before you can get to the mercy part. Most people that I have heard of that have had a family member murdered, takes them a good 2 or 3 years to get to the part where they can actually forgive the person or at least get over the anger towards the person that's murdered one of their family members.
The victim's family, under the Saudi legal system, will only consider mercy once the accused confesses. Confession is seen as the first step towards repentance and is fundamental to Saudi law.
See, the Saudi system's been going for, 1,400 years or something like that. And that was brought in by one of their prophets to stop the tribal wars between families in our civilised generation haven't got it in their countries, whereas the family's got a say in what the result is. Well, over here the family's got no say whatsoever. They got nothing for the victim. The victim's forgotten.
6 weeks after the murder, Yvonne Gilford's body was allowed back from Saudi Arabia for burial.
The funeral, that was a traumatic time. I've got utmost respect for the Foreign Affairs, how they worked on getting her body out of Saudi Arabia. The man from the consulate that picked up her body, he said it was a dull, overcast, dreary day. And he said when he picked up the coffin, put it in the back of the van to take to the airport, the sun come out and shone until such time as he got to the airport, then it closed in again. He said he couldn't believe it. So, what else you want to know?
Yvonne's friends were devastated in the weeks after the funeral by a story which spread across the world. It described Yvonne Gilford as a ruthless moneylender. The story was quickly proved to be untrue.
It's not Yvonne, we're not talking about Yvonne. But of course, once the headline is there, there's a lot of damage done.
Yvonne lived for a long time in South Africa. Before she went to Saudi Arabia, she asked her friend Sue Taylor to take control of her finances whilst she was away.
Yvonne was a great saver. And in the time she'd been in Saudi, she hadn't sent any money back. I had control of her bank accounts and I was doing banking and things for her monthly. She had sent no money back. And as we've learnt from other nurses who've been in Saudi, their salaries, although they were paid very well, were not always timeous. So they helped each other out. Yvonne did things as favours. She liked people. If she liked people, she would be there for you. You could phone her at 2 o'clock in the morning. She would come over. She was great, but not a usurer. She didn't do things for ulterior motive. She did them because she was your friend.
In the weeks leading up to the nurse's trial in Saudi Arabia, Frank Gilford hardened his resolve as he learned more of the nature of the killing.
It wasn't a nice murder. I mean, she was brutally murdered, and Frank had those details. It was a long and brutal murder. She was really, really almost tortured from what we've started to read now. And none of that was reported. It was reported that, you know, she'd been stabbed and that was it. It wasn't reported how Frank knew what all of the details were of how his sister had been murdered. He'd actually taken a forensic report and spoken to the doctor so he could explain to him what they had done to his sister.
The forensic report told the story of a frenzied attack in which severe blows to the head were followed by multiple stabbings.
Every day, the pressure on Frank Gilford and his wife increases, unimpressed by the nurses' protestations of innocence.
Do you believe these nurses? No comment.
Although the nurses in prison in Saudi Arabia were continuing to plead their innocence, Frank Gilford in Jamestown was receiving information from Saudi Arabia that persuaded him otherwise.
It wasn't just one avenue of information, it was several avenues of information that came in that all fitted together. Phone calls and letters from people that were at the hospital at the time, conveying what they knew, passing on what their thoughts were, and other little things through the Foreign Affairs and things like that all sort of welded themselves together that they convinced us that they were guilty.
Well, at the beginning I was hoping that he would pursue the situation differently. He comes from a religion and from a society in which capital punishment is not recognized. He did not see evidence, clear evidence, that his sister was killed by those two nurses. The matter was still in court, but he was quite quick in confirming that they were the killers. And that, in my opinion, was not quite appreciated by many people.
Leading Saudi lawyer Salah al-Hedgelan has a long history of working for the British government and British companies in Saudi Arabia. He was approached by the British embassy within a few days of the murder to defend the accused nurses. Frank Gilford got a Saudi lawyer too, who advised him to stick with the death penalty. But back in Jamestown, the heart-searching went on.
We had discussions between Laura and myself and other family members, what was the right thing to do, whether to stick with their laws or to wait and see what the verdict was going to be. You'd wake up in the middle of the night and say, well, what are we going to do, you know? And then you sort of lie there and look at all aspects that you could of it. It's not a very, very pleasant situation. We had the British media, the Australian media, and they all wanted to know the same things. How do you feel? What do you do? What are you going to do?
From here down to where your van is, it was just media all the time. And where that rubbish bin is over there, that they used to be hanging over the fence. And I used to come zipping in my car and just about take their toes off at the gate. They wouldn't shift, they'd just stand there, and I wasn't going to back off for them either, so.
You feel empty, you feel drained, but that's not what they wanted to hear from you. They want to hear that you feel angry, irate or savage, or you want this or you want that, whether it's beheadings or whatever. But you don't know until the time comes that what you're going to decide. And until you decide, you can't have any true feelings of how you really do feel.
In May 1997, Frank Gilford agreed that his lawyers in Saudi Arabia could formally request that the Saudi court impose the death penalty if the two nurses were found guilty. But he could still rescind it. So did he ever mean to go all the way?
The internationally publicised murder trial is now just a fortnight from opening in Saudi Arabia.
You can't come out and convict somebody and say, I think they're guilty, but I'm going to let them free, without the court convicting them. You've got to wait for a conviction before you can say, well, the court's decided, but now's the time for us to look at other decisions and, you know, no longer go for the death penalty and look at other forms of compensation or whatever.
There are also reports the federal government plans to intervene in the affair, asking the Saudi authorities to spare the accused if they're convicted. Today, a spokesman for Foreign Minister Alexander Downer said the government would wait until a verdict was handed down, then consider the options.
When I was in Britain in February of 1997, I met with John Major, still the Prime Minister then. He was interested, first of all, in what our reaction to the whole affair was. And I told him that we would support Frank Gilford through and through, and we wanted justice done for the murder of Yvonne Gilford, but we didn't want to see anyone executed. But we didn't make that public at the time. We didn't want to make that too public.
In Adelaide today, lawyers for the defendants argued that according to Saudi law, all heirs must agree for the death penalty to be carried out. And because Muriel Gilford, the 84-year-old mother of Frank and Yvonne, suffers from Alzheimer's disease, she's not mentally competent to agree with her son's call for execution.
They wanted mother taken out the circuit because they reckon she wasn't capable of making a decision.
But you're going to live longer than me then, dear.
Well, you never know.
This action against Frank Gilford in June 1997 could have bankrupted him. Lawyers acting for the nurses challenged his right to speak on behalf of his mother in demanding the nurses' execution. They also sued him for the distress caused to the nurses by their imprisonment.
We didn't arrest him. We didn't put him in jail. We didn't accuse him of anything, yet we're the ones that were being sued for all these things. How do you work that out? We just went with the legal system of the country.
Frankly, he had been hammered by people from left, right and centre, and I thought I had to do what I could here. I live in the same part of Australia as him, not in the outback, live in the same part of Australia as him, and he came to my house one evening with his wife. No media, we didn't tell the media. We just sat in the study in the house by the fire, and my wife made us all some coffee and biscuits and things, and we spent a long time talking about it. I thought, you know, not only did I oppose capital punishment, not only had the British government asked us to do what we could to try to save their lives, and I said I would, but I thought from Frank Gilford's point of view, it would leave him in the worst possible situation where he'd lost his sister, of all the emotional hurt that of course had caused, and on top of that would receive the sort of opprobrium of the international community for being responsible for the execution of the British nurses. So that really was my pitch, I guess. And I really felt that in the end he understood that and regarded that as the best outcome, that there would be some compensation, that under Sharia law that was the only way of doing it.
I feel that we had a good talk and discussion between ourselves on how we felt and how the government felt, and there was no pressure by the government whatsoever on any decision we made.
In the court in Adelaide, barrister John Keane was appointed to defend Frank Gilford over the nurses' charges against him. At the same time, the judges in Saudi Arabia were considering whether to impose the death penalty. On September the 3rd, 1997, the world learned that Deborah Parry had been sentenced to death. The news was immediately denied by the Saudi government, but by then it had already been widely publicised.
After acting for Frank for about 3 weeks, it was at 9 o'clock one night, I received a phone call from Saudi Arabia, and I was advised in that call that Parry had been found guilty of murder of Yvonne Gilford and sentenced to death. It was at that time I really said to myself that I have to talk to Frank and find out one way or another whether he really wanted the death penalty. To me, that call was pivotal, and from then on, the next day, I phoned up Michael Abbott to see whether he could help me advise on the South Australian proceedings, and secondly, what can we do about Frank and his predicament, now that it's quite clear that the death penalty may well be imposed upon Parry.
I can tell you this, that the first time I ever saw Frank Gilford, I said to him, Frank, if part of your instructions are to demand the death penalty, that is that the execution of these nurses, I can't act for you. I don't believe in the death penalty, and I find my personal belief which would affect me so much that I don't think I could properly act as your counsel. So if it's part of your instructions that you want the death penalty exacted in any case, on any basis, then goodbye. And that's when Frank told me that it wasn't part of his instructions. He did not want the death penalty. He was a humane man. He wanted the Saudi justice system to exact a penalty.
The thing is, if we rescinded the death penalty right from the word go. It left us and become a public right of the courts, and they could decide the penalty, which most probably would have been only 2 years in a Saudi jail, and they'd have been automatically released anyway. So while we still had that right to rescind the death penalty, we had other options that would have come up that we could look at, which, as history has proved, did come up, and we ascertained the situation and went down a separate road.
A lot of people think you must have changed your mind.
Well, I suppose you'd say changed your mind, but the thing is we never shut ourselves off from other options.
I said to Robin Cook when I was in London at the time of Princess Diana's funeral that it was enormously important that the British government did what they could to encourage the lawyers to put together some financial package.
All Frank wanted from this, and this is what he told me right from the start, was that he wanted a memorial to his sister. I therefore suggested to Frank that perhaps we ought to consider something at the Women and Children's Hospital which would tie in with her nursing activities. I spoke to the hospital management and asked them how much they'd need for a daycare centre, and that's basically how the figure of $1 million was arrived at.
In September 1997, the stage was set for a secret diplomatic shuttle between Canberra and Adelaide involving the British government as Michael Abbott attempted to strike a deal between Frank Gilford and the nurses. The problem was how to do it without alerting the media or the court in Saudi Arabia.
So that's when I brought the British High Commissioner, Sir Roger Carrick, into the loop. I must say that I was able to have very frank discussions with Sir Roger, who personally came to these chambers. We were able to talk in a position of complete confidence and mutual respect for each other, and he was just as anxious as I was to find a way out of all of this, which would give Frank what he wanted and achieve for the British government what it wanted, namely removal of the threat of public execution of 2 of their citizens in the main square in Dhahran or Riyadh or wherever it was going to take place.
We had a meeting in Michael Abbott's chambers with Sir Roger Carrick, the British High Commissioner, and the nurses' Adelaide lawyers. We sort of used him to be the facilitator. And so it didn't appear that we were talking to the nurses in case they wanted to rush off to the Saudi Arabian court and say that Frank has waived his rights. We can then deny that we're actually doing a deal with them.
So the nurses' lawyers were sitting there with Sir Roger Carrick?
Yes.
In the same room, but in a sense you were talking to Sir Roger and they were listening in.
That's right. It was in many ways unreal.
Were you aware that there was a lot of things going on behind the scenes?
Not really, no. We just took each day as it came, and when we were advised by our lawyers of what happened, we ascertained the situation then.
As the deal was being finalised on September the 23rd, the news broke that Lucille McClauchlan had been sentenced to 500 lashes and 8 years in prison for her role as an accessory in the murder. Within hours, the nurse's Saudi lawyer claimed he had reached an agreement with Frank Gilford.
I said, there has been a settlement. They said, no, there hasn't been. So I showed it in the newspaper. I produced it. Yes, I did use the media on that occasion. That's to show that the other party is not saying the truth. I said, there is a settlement agreement, and I declared it, and I gave a copy of it even.
3 weeks after Al-Hedgeland leaked the news, Frank Gilford and his lawyers finally confirmed publicly that £750,000 had been raised from British companies with interests in Saudi Arabia, and the deal was done.
Flanked by his Saudi and Australian lawyers, and obviously emotional, Frank Gilford today read a 3-page statement he hopes will end 10 months of intense pressure.
I'd like to announce that I have waived my right to ask that the death penalty be imposed on either of the nurses who have been charged with the murder of my sister Yvonne.
They'd put a lot of pressure on him to accept that money, and then the minute that he did, they were straight onto him that, oh, you've accepted blood money and all this sort of thing. And he, no matter what he did, whichever way he turned, he was going to be the bad person.
You know, we're the colonials, we're from down under, we're the convicts kicked out of England years ago, we're the riffraff, we're the people that were not worthy to live in England, and we made something of ourselves, and they determined that we're not. And basically that still echoes in their eyes, their papers and everything else like that. That's my opinion.
Perhaps it's a little presumptuous of me to speak with too much authority about what the British media or the general tone of the British media has been, but I get a sense that they think that Frank Gilford has been greedy. Now, Frank Gilford himself isn't keeping this money. This money is being overwhelmingly donated to the Women's and Children's Hospital in Adelaide. So that dispenses with that argument. That the money should change hands at all was not his wish either, but was the only way the lives of the nurses could be saved. And this man has saved the lives of, well, at least one of the nurses, simply saved their lives.
In May 1998, 8 months after Frank Gilford formally waived his rights, the 2 British nurses were released by the King of Saudi Arabia and flew home to England.
A 7-hour flight to freedom, but back to intense controversy. The backlash had begun, the nurses condemned for selling their story to the tabloids.
I knew or heard before they were released from prison that they'd signed contracts with the British press for substantial sums of money for their stories. With the abuse they've been giving the Saudi system, I think you'll find there'll be more information slowly come out that will bear up the facts that they definitely were guilty.
From the beginning in Jamestown, Frank and Laurel Gilford heard nothing that gave them reason to doubt that the accused British nurses were guilty. Staff at the Dhahran hospital had been contacting them with compelling information. We set out to corroborate this and tracked several of the staff down. Up to now, they've given no television interviews, unlike Deborah Parry, who's been pleading her innocence on the BBC's Panorama programme and ITV's Breakfast television show, with allegations that she and Lucille McClauchlan were tortured into confessing by the Saudi police.
If you are innocent, why did you sign a confession saying that you did commit this murder?
Because I went through sexual and physical and mental abuse by the Dhahran police in Saudi Arabia. We were stripped and touched. I had someone hitting me across the throat, pulling my hair, slapping my face, stamping on my feet. The psychological torture of being there for 16 hours a day for 5 days. It was absolutely horrendous. There was always this threat of rape all the time.
After the murder, Catherine Wall was also interviewed by the Saudi police. An experienced medical consultant who still works at the hospital in Dhahran, seen here at a desert picnic sitting next to Yvonne, she considered herself a close friend of Deborah Parry. But based on her own experience, she is sceptical of Deborah's account of the police methods.
We were treated so nicely, and so were the girls. I remember Debbie coming back after some of those interviews telling me how they had served them tea and how polite they were and how nice they were. They were, I think, very well aware of the trouble they were going to have just in having arrested them and having to do their job and catch the real killers. And I certainly, just common sense tells you, they knew they were going to be under international scrutiny. I don't think that they would have ever even considered those kind of methods.
2 days after the murder, nurse Caroline Pavlovska was interviewed by the police, along with Parry and McClauchlan, for several hours.
The first time I was interviewed, there were 3 policemen, and the door was always open. There was an interpreter, and people kept walking in and out of the room. It was quite amusing, really. The hospital interpreters were there, always present, even in their other interviews. So, I mean, they have witnesses, and I do believe there was always Matawa, a religious man, present too, with the two girls while they were being interviewed.
A few weeks after their arrests, Caroline received a letter from Deborah Parry in prison, which gave no hint of mistreatment. The letter said, "Jail is fine, putting on weight." She said she was being treated so well in prison.
You were telling me you were hit.
Yes, but you wouldn't see the way that they did it with their arms across my throat and that. You wouldn't see bruising.
But
they were very clever, pulling hair and slapping across the face and stamping on my feet.
But didn't you also allege at one stage that they put cigarette butts in your eye?
Not in my eye, close to my eye, so I could actually feel the heat.
The most damning attack on the nurses' credibility comes from their own side. It was when their lawyers first went to see them in prison that they said they wanted to withdraw their confessions, but they made no mention of police brutality.
They have never said to us that they were tortured. And there hasn't been any indication on them physically that they were. In addition to that, the police, the doctor who examined them immediately after the confession were written, did not indicate any of this on their body.
The body of Yvonne Gilford was discovered in her apartment by the police at 9:15 a.m. The details of how she died were only made known to senior hospital staff much later in the day. Colleagues of Parry and McClauchlan found it puzzling that they appeared to know more sooner than anyone else. That morning, Catherine Wall met Deborah Parry in the hospital. This was not long after the discovery of Yvonne Gilford's body.
She told me that Yvonne had actually been murdered. And she told me that Yvonne had been stabbed in the neck and the chest and the leg.
It's very important to put a time on this. What time was she telling you this?
Well, I didn't wait very long before I went up to the renal unit to talk to her about it, so I got in at 10. I'd say I went up there between 10:45 and 11 o'clock, before lunch, yeah.
So
well before lunch.
Certainly by 11 o'clock, she was telling you that Yvonne had been murdered and that she had been stabbed in a number of places.
Yes.
To your knowledge, did anyone else in the building know these details at that stage?
No. I mean, on the way up to the renal unit, I had talked to several people. Everyone knew that Yvonne had been found dead, but no one knew that it was murder. Certainly no one knew about stab wounds or the location of them.
We've confirmed that Deborah Parry also gave the details of the murder to another colleague that morning, but Parry told the BBC's Panorama a very different story.
When I watched the BBC interview, I was shocked to hear her say that she didn't really find out about the nature of the death, that it was murder or stabbing or any of those sort of details, until she was off work after 7 p.m. that night.
On the day following the murder, all the nurses who were off duty were assembled in the hospital and examined for signs of bruises or scratches on their necks and arms. By a twist of fate, Deborah Parry was on duty and missed the inspection.
Debbie phoned me to find out what had happened, and I told her that we had filed past the police and they had checked our necks and forearms for scratches. And she said, "Oh my God, Purdy," that was her cat, she said, "Purdy has scratched both my arms terribly, and now I'm going to look guilty." And I said, "Oh, I'm sure they can tell cat scratches from human scratches." That night she came over and she showed me her forearms, and both of her forearms were covered with scores of scratches, but they weren't long cat scratches. They were little crescent-shaped marks, like the shape of fingernails.
By all accounts, Deborah's cat Purdy is a gentle creature. But the scratches were not the only evidence of Deborah's involvement in a fight. Someone who was not interviewed by the police has now agreed to talk for the first time.
I've got a little salon in one of the bedrooms, just a small one, and I just do Westerners, Western ladies. Mostly there's a lot of nurses, there's a lot of British Aerospace, there's Americans. When I first met Debbie, she was very nice. I thought she was very nice, full of fun, you know. She used to come regular for a trim, and then she's had it permed and she's had it coloured. But this particular time, just before the murder, we coloured and cut it. And that was on the Sunday or the Monday, I forget which day. And then on the following Sunday, she was back wanting it cut again.
Did that surprise you?
It did. It really did surprise me, you know. She walked in, I remember her walking in, and me being me, turned around and says, "Oh my goodness, what's the matter? You look like shit." She looked terrible. She looked really, really awful. She had a lump out here and a lump out here, big clust. So naturally, me being me, just gave her a clout around the head and says, "What have you been doing with your hair?" She says, "Oh," she says, "I've got the thinning scissors." She says, "And I've cut there." She says, "I wanted to cut it shorter." Well, I thought then it was funny. To cut it shorter, you just don't cut a lump there and a lump there to have it shorter, you know?
Did it look like it had been cut or pulled?
Oh, pulled, definitely. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. If like she says, she did it with a thinning scissors, well, if she'd done it with a thinning scissors, usually they wouldn't go right to the roots to do it. You know, if you was doing it yourself, you'd go halfway, even somebody that didn't know what to do it. But there was bits from the roots, and, well, it was just out. The thinning scissors couldn't have done it like that. No, it was definitely a pull.
This evidence of Deborah's hair being pulled out has never been told first-hand before. Anne Fitzpatrick was on a brief visit to England from Saudi Arabia when we tracked her down. Up to now, she's been reluctant to speak out.
If it had gone to court and then I'd said about the hair and that, you know, I wouldn't like it was a murder, she could have been executed. I wouldn't like to think, oh, yes, she's been executed, although it's a very bad thing that she's done. But I didn't want the girl to be executed. But now, when she's come back here, and she's getting all this money and making out that she's so innocent and showing no remorse.
Part of my hair was missing because I had a bad haircut, and one of my colleagues knows that. So I went to the hairdressers. I was in a distraught state 3 days afterwards because of the fact it suddenly hit me that a friend of mine had actually died, and I just cried and cried and cried. When I was first told, I actually stopped walking because I was so upset for the fact that she'd been killed. I mean, she was still a colleague of mine. She wasn't a close friend, but she was a colleague of mine.
She was a close friend. She told me they used to go camping at weekends in the desert and that, practically every weekend. Debbie showed me photos the day she came for her hair colouring, like previous to the murder, and she showed me photos of when they'd been out in the desert, her and Yvonne and that.
Feeling I've got this sort of an intensity in the relationship, which then
yes, from one pole to the other, and you know, initially, you know, intensely friendly and happy, and then later on, an intense dislike.
Deborah Parry's friends were aware she had a history of depression, and for some time before the murder had expressed concern about her state of mind.
We were leaving the building, Yvonne and I, one morning. Early we were going to get the bus to Dammam. And as we were coming through the outside door, Yvonne just turned to me and she said, "You know, Caroline, I think Debbie is about to flip herself over the edge." And I was a bit shocked. I said, "Goodness, Yvonne." And she said, "And Lucy thinks so as well." and I've regretted really not being more willing to listen to what she had said now.
The extent of the wounds suffered by Yvonne Gilford are revealed by these diagrams based on the Saudi pathologist's report and prepared for us by leading forensic expert Dr. Ian West.
She's got cuts where the edge of the blade has been used. She's got stab injuries where the point of the blade has been used. The wounds are present on the front of her trunk, in the right breast, on the upper left abdomen, below the left breast, on the neck, on the back of the loin, on the right leg, and there are also injuries on the head, mainly on the scalp. There's a knife cut on the forehead, one of the ears, and one at the back of the head. You sometimes see this type of pattern of knife injury when somebody just simply lost control and they're stabbing, cutting as fast as they can.
I still feel guilty that I didn't see how badly Debbie was feeling at the time. I mean, after all, I worked in psychiatric hospitals for about 8 years, and I just wish that I had known that she wasn't sleeping, and I wish I had picked up on any signs of mania. I wish I had listened a little bit more closely when she told me how angry she was with Yvonne. I wish I had interpreted that differently. And also I have a lot of guilt about sitting here and saying all these things about Debbie. I felt like she was a member of my family who had done something terrible.
We invited Deborah Parry to take part in this film, but she declined to do so. The verdict of the Saudi court was to find Deborah Parry guilty of the murder of Yvonne Gilford and Lucille McClauchlan guilty of being an accessory. This tragedy in Saudi Arabia has left its mark on many people, and none more so than Frank Gilford back in Jamestown. So does he feel bitter now about the two nurses, freed so soon after the murder?
Nobody's gained. We've lost a sister. They've lost their lifestyle. They've been convicted of a crime. Their families have been, like us, a traumatic experience, publicity and all that sort of stuff. They've lost out. The money, well, the money's only just nothing. And that's going to be put to a useful purpose, most of it. So nobody's won.
Frank Gilford kept just £20,000 of the £750,000 payment to cover his expenses after legal fees were deducted. He donated the remaining £500,000 to the Adelaide Women and Children's Hospital.
This is National 9 News.
An intensely private man, Frank Gilford arrived at the Women's and Children's Hospital hoping this would be his final public act. But it is an extraordinary act, a self-described ordinary man giving away the biggest cheque of his life. This act of generosity was born out of a brutal act of murder.